I woke up to the sound of a splash and an angry goose honking like a car alarm stuck on full blast. Throwing on my boots, I bolted across the yard toward my private pond, half expecting to find a loose dog or maybe a raccoon causing trouble. Instead, what I saw made me skid to a stop in pure disbelief. There, thigh deep in the water with a fishing rod in one hand and a plastic wine glass in the other, stood Karen from the neighboring subdivision, shrieking as my territorial goose pecked at her behind. Her floppy hat was floating away, and a soggy folding chair lay capsized nearby. It was like a scene from a sitcom gone horribly wrong, but the punchline was that she was on my land, in my pond, without a shred of permission. At that moment, standing on my muddy shoreline, I knew my quiet retirement dream had just turned into a full-blown war I never asked for. For the past few years, the pond had been my sanctuary, a piece of heaven I had fought hard to afford. After spending 3 decades as a firefighter in the city, dodging death and carrying strangers out of burning buildings, I wanted nothing more than peace. I bought this patch of rural land because it promised me exactly that. It came with a spring-fed pond that I spent my savings on restoring, carefully stocking it with bass, catfish, and a few rare koi for good luck. It was not just water to me. It was a living memory, a reflection of every sacrifice I had made over the years. I built a little dock by hand, set up benches under the weeping willows, and even installed solar lights along the shoreline so I could sit there with my dog, Samson, during long summer nights. That pond was mine, legally, emotionally, and spiritually. So seeing Karen acting like she was the queen of it cracked something deep inside me. She didn't just stumble in by mistake. No, she had dragged in a whole setup, a cooler, fishing tackle, a Bluetooth speaker blaring country music at full volume. The sight was so absurd that for a moment, I just stood there blinking, wondering if I was still dreaming. Karen, oblivious to my presence, reeled in a wriggling catfish and hooted loudly, raising her glass in a mock toast to the sky. Samson barked sharply beside me, snapping me back to reality. I cleared my throat, loud enough to rattle the crows in the trees. Karen turned around mid-toast and blinked at me like I was the one intruding. "Oh, hey, neighbor," she chirped, wading toward the bank without a hint of shame. Thought I would enjoy the neighborhood pond today. Perfect weather, huh? Neighborhood pond. The words hit me like a slap. My fists clenched involuntarily at my sides. Karen had always been nosy, the kind who thought her HOA status gave her dominion over everything she laid eyes on. But until now, she had mostly limited herself to passive-aggressive notes about lawn heights and mailbox paint. I had stayed under the radar, thinking if I kept to myself she would leave me alone. Clearly, I had underestimated her sense of entitlement. "This is private property," I said, keeping my voice even. "This is my pond. You are trespassing." Karen just laughed, a high-pitched titter that set my teeth on edge. "Oh, come on," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Everyone knows the HOA owns all the communal green spaces around here. You're lucky I didn't invite more people. I thought about setting up a picnic." I was momentarily speechless, struggling to process the sheer audacity. First, my property was not even under her HOA jurisdiction. When I bought the land, one of its selling points was that it was outside the boundaries, free from their endless regulations. Second, even if it were common property, which it absolutely was not, she still would have needed permission to wade into it like she owned the place. Not willing to argue on muddy ground, I pointed firmly toward her cooler and gear. "Pack it up, Karen. You're trespassing. Leave now." Karen's face twisted into a tight little smirk, the kind that promised nothing but trouble. "We'll see about that," she said sweetly, gathering her things at an infuriatingly slow pace. As she sloshed back toward her truck, she made a big show of slipping and stumbling dramatically, like she was preparing material for a lawsuit. By the time she finally peeled out of my gravel driveway in her SUV, I had already made up my mind. This wasn't going to be one of those neighborly misunderstandings you laugh about over coffee. No, this was going to turn into a full-blown territorial war if I didn't put my foot down immediately. Later that evening, as the sun sank behind the pond and the fireflies began blinking over the water, I walked the perimeter with a hammer and nails, putting up fresh, no trespassing signs every 10 feet. I even printed one that read private pond, no public access, no fishing, no exceptions, in bold red letters so big you could see it from orbit. Samson trotted beside me, wagging his tail, blissfully unaware of the battle lines being drawn. Still, a tiny voice in the back of my mind whispered that Karen wouldn't be deterred by a few signs. The woman thought she could bend reality itself to fit her whims. She had the kind of stubborn, self-righteous energy that bulldozed common sense. The next morning, when I found fresh footprints leading down to the water's edge and an empty pier can bobby near the dock, I knew I had been right. Karen wasn't just bold. She was declaring war, and if she wanted a war over my pond, she was going to get one she would never forget. The next morning, I sat on my porch sipping coffee and staring at the pond, trying to figure out my next move. The water was calm, shimmering under the rising sun, but my mind was anything but peaceful. There was no mistaking the footprints I had found along the edge or the crushed beer can floating near my dock. Karen had come back after our confrontation, bold as brass, probably laughing to herself the whole time. It wasn't just disrespect anymore. It was a declaration. She thought she could walk all over me just because she had gotten away with bullying the rest of the neighborhood for years. Well, she had just picked a fight with the wrong man. I figured the first step was to give her the benefit of the doubt one last time, even though my gut screamed it wouldn't work. Maybe if I caught her again and made it perfectly clear with zero room for misinterpretation, she would finally back off. It was wishful thinking, but I had been a firefighter long enough to know that sometimes you had to exhaust every reasonable option before turning up the heat. So I waited. I canceled my morning trip to town, set up a chair under the big oak tree that overlooked the pond, and kept Samson close by. It didn't take long. Around mid-morning, I heard the low rumble of tires crunching down my gravel drive. I stayed hidden under the tree's shadow as Karen's SUV came into view, windows down, country music blaring like it was a personal concert. She parked with her tires half on my grass, popped the trunk, and started unloading like she was setting up a tailgate party. A folding chair, a tackle box, a cooler, and a colorful umbrella she stabbed into the ground like she was claiming a beachhead. The casual disrespect was almost impressive in its brazenness. I stood up and walked calmly toward her, Samson padding along at my side. Karen looked up and smiled like we were old friends bumping into each other at the store. "Morning, neighbor," she chirped, adjusting the angle of her umbrella. "Going to be a hot one today. Perfect for fishing. This is your last warning," I said, my voice steady but loud enough to cut through her music. "This is private property. You are trespassing. Pack up your stuff and leave now." Karen didn't even blink. She crossed her arms and cocked her hip to the side, the universal posture of someone gearing up for a pointless argument. "Actually," she said, dragging out the word like she was explaining something to a particularly slow child, "this pond falls under communal green space rules according to the HOA charter, which means it's for everybody." "No, it doesn't," I said, pulling a folded paper from my back pocket. I had spent half the night printing out the property documents, just in case. "Here's the survey. Here's the deed. Here's the boundary map. You see this line? It's the edge of my property. This pond is entirely within my land. You have no right to be here." Karen took the papers with a theatrical sigh and skimmed them for all of 2 seconds before tossing them back at my feet. "Well, the HOA says otherwise," she said smugly. "Maybe you should take it up with them." "There is no HOA authority here," I said. "My land is outside the HOA boundaries. Your rules don't apply. Period." Karen smiled sweetly, the way a shark might smile just before it bites. "We'll see about that," she said, flipping open her tackle box and pulling out a neon green lure. "As far as I'm concerned, if there's water and fish, it's public access and I'm going to enjoy my day." I stared at her for a long moment, the anger rising like heat off the pavement. This wasn't ignorance. This was intentional. She was daring me to escalate, but two could play at that game. Without another word, I turned on my heel and walked back to the house, Samson at my side. I could hear Karen behind me, humming along to her music, blissfully unconcerned. It would be her last carefree fishing trip on my land. I spent the next few hours reinforcing my perimeter. I ordered new no trespassing signs online, the kind backed with legal codes and bright red warnings about prosecution. I called the sheriff's office and explained the situation. They confirmed what I already knew. I had every right to press trespassing charges if she came back. I even began sketching plans to install a security fence around the pond, something discreet but effective. That afternoon, I decided to take a drive into town to talk to the county office directly. It was a small, dusty building tucked behind the courthouse, manned by a handful of clerks who knew everything there was to know about land ownership in the area. I explained the situation to a woman named Meredith, who listened patiently before pulling up the official records. "Well," she said, tapping the computer screen with her pen, "it doesn't get much clearer than this. Your property line fully encloses the pond. And according to this document, you also own full water rights. That means the pond and everything in it is legally yours. No public access required." "Can I get copies?" I asked. Meredith smiled and started printing. "As many as you want, honey." By the time I left, I had a thick stack of certified copies in my hand, enough to wallpaper Karen's whole house if I wanted to. I was feeling a little better, a little more in control. Maybe if I presented her with these official documents, she would finally back off. Maybe she would see that she had picked the wrong battle and slink away to find some other poor soul to harass. But deep down, I knew better. Karen wasn't the type to admit she was wrong. She would twist and turn and squirm like a cornered snake before giving up. If I wanted to protect my pond, I would have to be ready for whatever nonsense she cooked up next. As I pulled back into my driveway, the sun was dipping low, painting the pond in brilliant golds and oranges. I parked the truck, grabbed the documents, and headed toward the water, Samson bounding ahead. I hammered a new sign into the ground right at the edge of the pond, laminated copies of the property deed attached underneath. Clear, bold, and undeniable. Private property. No trespassing. All violators will be prosecuted. It wasn't just a sign. It was a line in the sand. Karen wanted a fight. She just got one. The next morning, I woke up with a strange feeling deep in my gut, a tightness that told me the situation with Karen was far from over. Sure enough, when I stepped out onto the porch with my coffee, I saw her car parked near the far end of the pond. There she was again, sitting proudly in her folding chair, line cast deep into the water, acting like nothing had happened. I gritted my teeth and walked down to the edge of the property. This time, I didn't bother calling out. I walked straight up to her with a stack of official documents tucked under my arm, Samson trotting faithfully beside me. Karen glanced up and gave me the same smug smile she had worn the day before, the one that made my blood pressure spike a few notches. Without saying a word, I unfolded the first page and held it out to her. "Deed to the land and water rights," I said flatly. "Certified by the county office. You're trespassing, and if you don't leave immediately, I will call the sheriff and press charges." Karen plucked the paper from my hand with exaggerated care, gave it a glance, and then tossed it onto the ground like a piece of trash. "That's cute," she said, smirking. "But the HOA rules still apply." "They do not," I said, my voice rising despite myself. "You have no authority here. This pond is mine. My land, my water, my rights." Karen stood up and planted herself squarely in front of me, arms crossed, chin jutting out stubbornly. "We'll just see what the board has to say about that," she said. "I already put in a complaint about you." "Good," I said, "and I'll be filing a trespassing report against you." Karen laughed, a shrill, unpleasant sound that made Samson bark once in alarm. "You think anyone cares about a grumpy old man hoarding a pond?" She snapped. "This neighborhood is about community. You can't just keep resources to yourself." I stared at her in disbelief. Resources? She talked like I was stockpiling emergency rations instead of simply protecting the land I had worked for. I turned on my heel and marched back to the house, knowing full well that arguing with her any further was like trying to argue with a thunderstorm. You could shout at the sky all you wanted, but it was going to rain whether you liked it or not. Inside, I made a few quick phone calls. First to the sheriff's office, who promised to send someone out if she did not leave soon. Then to my lawyer, who was more than happy to draft a cease and desist letter. By noon, the paperwork was ready, and I was feeling a lot more confident. Karen might be stubborn, but the law was on my side. Later that afternoon, as I was fixing a loose board on the dock, I heard the unmistakable sound of voices. Peeking through the trees, I saw that Karen had brought reinforcements. 3 other women from the subdivision had joined her, each with their own fishing poles, coolers, and lawn chairs. It looked like a full-blown party. They even had a Bluetooth speaker blaring country music across the pond. The same obnoxious song on repeat. It was almost impressive, the sheer gall it took to double down after being presented with legal proof. Karen wasn't just challenging me. She was daring me to do something about it. I tightened my grip on the hammer in my hand and took a deep breath. Getting angry wouldn't help. I needed to stay calm, stay smart. I grabbed my phone and started recording video from the edge of the woods. Clear footage of Karen and her friends trespassing, drinking beer, littering, and blaring music at top volume. Every word, every laugh, every illegal cast into my pond, all captured with timestamps and GPS tags. By the time I was done, I had enough evidence to make a rock-solid case against them. The next morning, I drove straight to the county courthouse and filed a formal complaint. I submitted the video evidence along with the property documents and the cease and desist letter. The clerk at the counter, a wiry old man with thick glasses, gave me a sympathetic look as he stamped everything with official seals. "Happens more than you'd think," he said. "People move out here thinking they're entitled to whatever they see. You're doing the right thing." Feeling a little lighter, I stopped by the sheriff's office next. Deputy Jackson, a big guy with a handlebar mustache, listened carefully to my story and watched the video on my phone. He chuckled a few times at the footage, especially the part where one of Karen's friends tripped over a cooler and nearly fell into the water. "Looks like an open and shut case," he said, handing my phone back. "We'll issue them official warnings. If they come back, we can arrest them for trespassing." "Thank you," I said, shaking his hand firmly. By the time I pulled back into my driveway, a storm was gathering on the horizon, thick black clouds boiling in from the west. It seemed fitting. Trouble was coming, and it was time to batten down the hatches. Sure enough, that evening I heard the unmistakable sound of tires crunching on gravel. I stepped out onto the porch just in time to see Karen's SUV pull up, flanked by another car I didn't recognize. Out stepped Karen, her usual smugness replaced by a tight, furious scowl. Beside her was a man in a cheap suit, holding a clipboard. I guessed he was some sort of HOA representative, though he looked about as official as a mall Santa. "Good evening," the man said, walking up to the porch while Karen trailed behind him like a shadow. "I'm Mr. Reynolds with the HOA board. We've received multiple complaints regarding your misuse of community resources." I leaned casually against the porch rail, arms crossed. "This is private property," I said. "I have the deeds, the water rights, and legal protection. Your HOA has no jurisdiction here." Mr. Reynolds hesitated, clearly thrown off by my confidence. He glanced at Karen, who nodded fiercely, urging him to push on. "We'll be conducting a formal investigation," he said, puffing out his chest. "If you're found in violation, you could face fines and penalties." "Good luck with that," I said. "You're trespassing right now. If you don't leave, I will call the sheriff." Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red, and she opened her mouth to argue, but Mr. Reynolds grabbed her arm and pulled her back toward the cars. Clearly, he wasn't eager to test me. They drove off in a hurry, leaving a trail of dust and empty threats behind them. I watched them go, heart pounding but satisfied. They could huff and puff all they wanted. The law was on my side, and I wasn't backing down. That night, as the rain finally broke and hammered against the roof, I sat by the window watching the storm and feeling a fierce kind of peace. Karen had fired her best shot and missed. She thought she could scare me off with her fake authority, but all she had done was strengthen my resolve. The battle wasn't over, but the tides had turned. The rain had finally stopped by morning, leaving the ground soggy and the pond swollen to its very edges. I spent the first part of the day repairing a bit of fencing that had been knocked loose by the storm. grateful for the fresh smell of wet earth and the way the sky seemed scrubbed clean. I was just starting to believe that maybe the worst with Karen was over when I heard the low rumble of another vehicle approaching. This time it wasn't Karen's familiar SUV, but a battered old pickup truck I didn't recognize. 2 men climbed out, both wearing matching neon vests, the kind contractors wore when they thought they needed to look official. One carried a clipboard, the other a big duffel bag slung over his shoulder. "Morning, sir," the clipboard guy called out as they walked up the drive. "We're here on behalf of the HOA to do an environmental inspection." I raised an eyebrow. I never requested an inspection. I said flatly, "And the HOA has no authority here. You're on private property. I suggest you leave before I call the sheriff." Clipboard guy smiled tightly and waved his papers at me. "Just standard procedure," he said. "We have the right to make sure the community's natural resources are being properly maintained." "This pond is not a community resource," I said, voice sharp. "It's mine. You're trespassing." The second guy had been quietly rummaging in his duffel bag. Now he pulled out a large canister marked "Pond Treatment Chemicals" in bold letters. My stomach twisted. They were planning to tamper with the water. "Get off my land," I barked, stepping forward. "Now." For a moment, they hesitated. Then the guy with the canister muttered something under his breath and shoved it back into the bag. Clipboard guy gave me a fake apologetic smile and started backing toward the truck. "We'll just report non-compliance to the board," he said. "You do that," I replied, "and tell Karen she'll be hearing from my lawyer." They climbed into the truck and peeled out in a spray of gravel. I stood there for a long time after they left, breathing hard, feeling the rage coil tighter and tighter in my chest. They had crossed a new line. It wasn't just about fishing anymore. Karen was trying to sabotage my pond itself. That night, I installed trail cameras around the property, high up in the trees where they wouldn't be easily spotted. I set them to motion detection, rigged them with solar chargers, and checked the settings twice. If Karen or her goons came back, I would have every move documented. I even strung up a few extra "No TRESPASSING" signs, this time with warnings about surveillance and prosecution. It was around midnight when Samson growled low in his throat, waking me from a restless sleep. I grabbed my flashlight and slipped quietly onto the porch, heart hammering. Through the trees, I caught the faint glint of flashlights bobbing near the pond. Someone was out there. I moved silently across the yard, keeping low, and got close enough to see 3 figures standing near the dock. Karen was one of them, her shrill voice carrying over the water. "Dump it in," she whispered urgently. "Hurry, before he notices." The guy from before was fumbling with the chemical canister, trying to open it. I didn't wait. I switched on the brightest setting on my flashlight and beamed it directly at them. "Drop it!" I shouted. They froze, deer in headlights. Karen screeched and stumbled backward, slipping on the muddy bank and landing squarely in the shallow water with a splash that echoed across the night. The guy with the canister dropped it and bolted for the trees. The other 2 scrambled after him, leaving Karen floundering in the mud. She struggled to her feet, soaked and furious, and made a beeline for her SUV. Tires screeched as she tore out of there like the devil himself was chasing her. I picked up the abandoned canister carefully and checked the label. It was an alga concentrate, highly toxic in large doses, capable of killing fish and plant life if used improperly. They had intended to poison my pond. My fists shook with barely controlled anger. The next morning, I marched into the sheriff's office with the canister, the trail camera footage, and the timeline of everything that had happened. Deputy Jackson watched the footage grimly, his jaw tight. "This is serious," he said. "This is attempted vandalism and environmental sabotage. We're talking felony charges." I nodded grimly. "I want to press every charge available." He clapped me on the shoulder. "We'll take it from here." Word spread through the community faster than wildfire. Karen had always been a busybody, always teetering on the edge of outrageousness. But now she had crossed into full-blown criminal territory. The footage of her slipping into the pond went viral in the local Facebook groups, much to the delight of the neighbors who had quietly despised her for years. Memes popped up overnight showing Karen in her muddy glory, with captions like "Pond Queen" and water rights warrior. The HOA board, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal, issued an official statement disavowing Karen and condemning her actions. Mr. Reynolds, the clipboard coward, resigned within the week. Karen herself went strangely quiet, her bright yard signs disappearing, her smug smiles gone. For the first time in months, peace returned to my little slice of heaven. The pond sparkled in the sunlight, undisturbed and pure. Samson chased dragonflies along the shore. I rebuilt the dock stronger than before, added a few new benches, and even planted some native flowers along the banks to attract more wildlife. But I wasn't finished yet. Karen had tried to destroy something precious to me. I intended to make sure she paid for it, one court date at a time. When the official court summons arrived at her door, delivered by a grim-faced sheriff's deputy, I was sitting on my porch with a glass of sweet tea, watching the whole thing unfold with quiet satisfaction. Karen's face turned beet red as she snatched the papers and slammed the door shut. I smiled to myself and raised my glass in a silent toast. The battle wasn't just over. It was about to reach a whole new level. The courthouse buzzed with a low hum of noise as people shuffled in and out, some chatting nervously, others glancing down at their phones to avoid eye contact. I sat at the far end of a long wooden bench, dressed in my cleanest jeans and a button-down shirt, a folder of carefully organized evidence resting on my lap. Samson wasn't allowed inside, but he sat patiently in the truck parked just outside, probably snoozing and dreaming of chasing squirrels. I couldn't blame him. I wished I could sleep through this mess too. Across the room, Karen sat with her arms folded tightly across her chest, her mouth twisted into a scowl that could have soured milk. Beside her, a slick-looking lawyer flipped through a thin file with an expression that said he already knew they were losing. Every so often, Karen would hiss something under her breath, and he would nod with the weary air of a man who had made a terrible mistake taking this case. When the clerk finally called our case, I stood up and followed my attorney, a sharp-witted woman named Elaine, to the front. Karen and her lawyer shuffled up too, trying to look composed but failing miserably. The judge, an older man with silver hair and a weathered face, peered at us over his glasses like we were bugs under a microscope. He tapped his gavel once, more out of habit than necessity, and called the session to order. Elaine began by presenting our evidence. She laid out the property deed, the certified water rights documentation, the cease and desist letter, the sheriff's reports, and finally, the crown jewel, the video footage from the trail cameras showing Karen and her crew sneaking onto my land and attempting to poison the pond. Each piece was presented methodically, with calm precision, the evidence building like a slow, inevitable tide. When she played the video of Karen slipping into the mud and scrambling away in the dark, a few stifled chuckles rippled through the small courtroom. Even the judge's mouth twitched as if he were fighting a smile. Karen's lawyer attempted to argue that she had been confused about property boundaries, that she had been acting with the best of intentions for the environment, and that no real damage had occurred since I had stopped them before they dumped the chemicals. The judge listened patiently, nodding occasionally, but his face was a mask of polite disbelief. When Karen herself was called to testify, she marched up to the stand with all the bravado of a child daring a parent to issue punishment. She insisted that the pond looked like a community resource, that no one had ever told her otherwise, and that she had only wanted to make sure it was properly cared for. Elaine's cross-examination was swift and merciless. She walked Karen through the property lines, the warning signs, the verbal warnings I had given her, and finally the footage of her laughing and joking about dumping the chemicals. Karen's defenses crumbled one by one until she sat slumped in the witness chair, cheeks burning red, muttering half-hearted excuses that fooled no one. After hearing all the evidence, the judge leaned back in his chair and laced his fingers together thoughtfully. He was silent for a long moment, letting the weight of everything settle over the room. Then he delivered his verdict in a slow, firm voice. Karen was found guilty of criminal trespassing, attempted vandalism, and environmental endangerment. She was fined heavily for the damages, ordered to pay restitution for legal fees, and issued a permanent restraining order banning her from coming within 100 yards of my property. If she violated the order, she would face immediate arrest. Karen's face twisted into something ugly as the judge spoke, her fists clenching at her sides. Her lawyer whispered urgently in her ear, probably telling her not to make it worse. But Karen had never been good at listening. She glared at me across the courtroom, her eyes full of rage and humiliation, before storming out in a flurry of angry footsteps. I stood there for a moment, letting the victory sink in. It wasn't just about the money or the legal win. It was about standing my ground, about protecting what was mine from someone who thought they could take whatever they wanted without consequences. I walked out of the courthouse feeling lighter than I had in weeks, the weight of the battle finally lifting from my shoulders. Outside, Samson barked excitedly when he saw me. I opened the truck door, and he jumped onto the seat, tail wagging furiously. "Good boy," I said, scratching behind his ears. "We're going home." Driving back to the ranch, the sun broke through the clouds in wide golden beams, lighting up the fields and the pond in the distance. The sight filled me with a fierce pride. I had fought for this land, for the peace it offered, and I had won, not through violence or anger, but through patience, persistence, and a stubborn refusal to be bullied. Over the next few weeks, Karen's presence in the neighborhood all but vanished. Her yard, once meticulously decorated with seasonal banners and immaculate flower beds, grew wild and unkempt. Her SUV was rarely seen on the street. Rumors floated around that she was planning to move, though no one seemed particularly sad about it. The few neighbors who had been friendly with her distanced themselves quickly, eager to avoid being caught in the fallout. Meanwhile, life on the ranch settled back into its old rhythm. I spent my days repairing fences, tending the pond, and enjoying long walks with Samson through the fields. The air seemed fresher, the sky wider. I even started planning a small 4th of July barbecue, inviting a few of the neighbors who had been quietly supportive through the whole ordeal. It felt good to open my land to people who respected it, who understood what it meant to fight for a piece of peace in a noisy world. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the fireflies began to blink along the pond's edge, I sat on the dock with Samson lying at my feet. The water rippled gently in the breeze, a few fish jumping now and then to catch the evening bugs. I sipped a cold lemonade and let the quiet settle over me, a deep and satisfying silence that needed no words. In the distance, I could hear the faint sounds of children laughing, someone mowing a lawn, the far-off hum of a tractor, the ordinary sounds of life, the sounds of a community that, for all its quirks and conflicts, still respected the simple idea that what is yours should be yours alone. I smiled to myself and leaned back against the dock, staring up at the endless sky. Karen had come into my life like a storm, loud and destructive, but she hadn't washed anything away. If anything, she had only made me hold tighter to the things that mattered: freedom, peace, and the right to sit beside my own pond, knowing that I had earned every last inch of it. The summer rolled on, and with each passing day, the memories of the chaos Karen had stirred up began to fade like footprints in the sand. My pond glistened under the clear blue skies, untouched and thriving, the way it was always meant to be. The koi swam lazily in the cool waters. The bass leaped for flies, and the weeping willows cast their long, comforting shadows across the banks. It was everything I had worked for and defended, and now it finally felt like home again. The neighbors who had once kept their distance began to stop by more often, some bringing pies or homemade jam as a quiet gesture of support. They would stay for a coffee or a cold lemonade, sitting on the benches by the pond and swapping stories about Karen's past antics, as if purging the last of her influence from our little corner of the world. One evening, as the fireflies lit up the field like tiny floating stars, I decided to add one final touch to the pond, something that would stand as a gentle but permanent reminder. I spent a week carving the wood by hand, sanding it until it was smooth and sealing it against the elements. When it was ready, I posted it right by the new entrance gate, a beautiful, sturdy archway I had installed with the township's blessing. The sign read, "Private Pond. Fishing allowed by invitation only. Karen not included." It made me chuckle every time I passed it, and the neighbors thought it was hilarious. Even the mayor came by during a community event and laughed heartily when he saw it, slapping me on the back and congratulating me on my resilience. It felt good to laugh again without the shadow of conflict looming overhead. For too long I had been weary, waiting for the next intrusion, the next petty sabotage. But Karen was gone. Rumor had it she had put her house up for sale and was looking for a new start somewhere else, far away from the people she had alienated. Some felt a little sorry for her, a woman so consumed by the need to control that she had driven herself out of her own community. But I couldn't bring myself to feel much pity. Everyone has a choice. Karen had made hers. One afternoon, a few weeks later, I found myself sitting at the pond's edge, fishing rod in hand, Samson lying beside me, his head resting on his paws. The bobber floated gently on the surface of the water, glinting in the sunlight. I wasn't even really trying to catch anything. It was about the ritual, the peace, the simple pleasure of being connected to something real and unspoiled. I thought about everything that had happened, the endless meetings, the court dates, the confrontations. It all seemed so distant now, like a bad dream fading with the dawn. As I reeled in the empty line and cast it again, I heard footsteps approaching. Turning slightly, I saw one of the younger kids from the neighborhood, a boy named Tyler who loved to fish but had always been too shy to ask. He stood a few feet back, hands stuffed awkwardly in his pockets, eyes darting between me and the pond. "Hey there," I said, giving him a smile. "You like fishing?" He nodded eagerly but didn't move closer. "Well, grab a rod," I said, pointing to the spare one propped against a nearby tree. "You're welcome to join as long as you follow one rule." He looked up at me wide-eyed. "Respect the pond," I said. "Leave it better than you found it." He grinned from ear to ear and scrambled over to grab the rod. Together we sat, casting our lines into the clear waters, the quiet lapping of the pond, the chirp of the cicadas, and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface filling the air around us. It felt right. It felt like the reward at the end of a long, hard journey. Over time, more neighbors began to visit the pond, always asking permission first, always treating it with care. Sometimes we would have small gatherings, a few folks bringing lawn chairs and coolers of lemonade and iced tea, sharing laughter and stories as the sun dipped low in the sky. It was never chaotic, never intrusive. It was a celebration of respect and community, the way it should be. The pond became more than just a body of water. It became a quiet symbol of what could be built when boundaries were honored and when people fought not with fists, but with patience and integrity. One evening, as I locked the new gate after a particularly pleasant barbecue, I paused for a moment and looked out over the water. The moon was rising, casting a silver path across the pond's surface. I thought about how close I had come to losing all of this, not physically, maybe, but in spirit. If I had given in, if I had let Karen bully me out of my rights, this place would have been tainted forever, a constant reminder of defeat. But I had stood firm, not just for myself, but for the principle that what is earned and cared for must be defended against those who believe they can take without asking. As the crickets sang and Samson leaned against my leg, I felt a deep, bone-deep satisfaction. This was more than a victory. It was a reminder that sometimes the quiet battles, the ones fought with paperwork, patience, and a stubborn refusal to back down, are the ones that matter most. Life went on. The seasons changed. The leaves turned gold and crimson and then fell away, leaving the trees bare and beautiful against the winter sky. Snow blanketed the fields, the pond froze over, and I traded my fishing rod for a snow shovel. But through it all, the peace remained, a steady, unshakable heartbeat beneath the rhythms of daily life. And in the end, that was the real victory. Not that Karen had been driven away, not that I had won in court, or even that the pond remained untouched. The real victory was the quiet, the stillness, the unshakable knowledge that some things are worth fighting for, and that when you fight with honor and patience and a clear heart, you build something stronger than fences or laws. You build peace. And as I stood there that winter evening, with Samson beside me, watching the first stars blink to life in the crisp, clear sky, I smiled and whispered a promise to the land around me. You are safe.